The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the sort of unremarkable detail that only matters in retrospect. Miss Cecily Vane did not read it immediately. She was busy at the time, standing at the long work table in the Hartwell Library with 3 candles lit against the November dark, copying the household accounts into a clean ledger at the direction of the estate steward, Mr. Pemsey, who had asked her specifically because her penmanship was clear and her arithmetic did not err. It was not the work of a lady. It was not, Cecily had long since accepted, the work she had expected to be doing at 23 years of age, in the year that was supposed to have been her 2nd season. Expectation and reality had parted company the spring her father died, and she had learned since then to find a kind of quiet pride in the things she could do well, rather than grieve the things she had lost. The letter sat on the edge of the table, the Hartwell seal pressed into dark wax, addressed in Lady Moorcroft's narrow handwriting to Mrs. Eugenia Vane, her mother, which meant it was not, technically, Cecily's to open. She finished the column she was working on. She blotted the ledger. She set the pen down and looked at the letter, the way one looks at a thing one suspects, but cannot yet prove. Outside the tall library windows, the frost was already thickening on the grass. Somewhere above, the Marquis of Hartwell was doing whatever marquises did in private, which in Lord Ashmore's case was, she had been given to understand, nothing sociable. She had been in service as a lady's companion to his aunt, Mrs. Dorothy Appel, for 7 months, and in those 7 months she had seen the Marquis at close quarters, exactly 4 times. He had not addressed her once. The room had decided what she was within a week of her arrival. A Vane of Wiltshire, yes, but the Vane whose father had lost everything and left his women to the charity of distant connections. A companion. Useful, she was told by Lady Moorcroft's 2nd footman in the way footmen relay the verdicts of their employers, but not to be confused with a guest. Cecily picked up the letter. She did not open it. She carried it upstairs to her mother, who was sitting with Mrs. Pell in the rose drawing room, and she set it on the card table beside her mother's hand, and she stood where she could see. She had learned since her father died that the world's business had a way of proceeding without her awareness, and the costs of that proceeding were nearly always hers. Her mother broke the seal. The color left Mrs. Vane's face in a single smooth motion, the way snow slides from a roof. Cecily read the letter over her mother's shoulder. It took her 12 seconds. Then she went very still. Lady Moorcroft had written to inform Mrs. Vane that she had been made aware of a debt, a promissory note in the amount of £430, signed by the late Mr. Vane and owed to a Mr. Callum Prest, a solicitor's agent from Bristol. The debt was overdue by 11 months. Mr. Prest had applied to her ladyship because he had understood the Vane women to be residing under Hartwell's roof, and he wished to ensure that Mrs. Vane was apprised of the legal remedy available to him should the matter remain unresolved before the month's end. There was a second note at the bottom in Lady Moorcroft's own hand, which said that she had thought it best to make the matter known at once, and that, of course, she could not have any legal unpleasantness attached to this house. Mrs. Pell looked up from her embroidery. Her eyes traveled from Mrs. Vane's face to Cecily's and back. "Is it bad news, my dears?" "It is a misunderstanding," Cecily said before her mother could speak. She said it because it was true. She said it because she had kept her father's papers in a cedar box under her bed since the estate was settled, and she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had read every document in that box 3 times, that her father had never borrowed from a man named Prest. She said it because her hands were very steady, and her voice was steady, and the steadiness was the only weapon she currently possessed. She said it, too, because she had noticed something in the 12 seconds she had had the letter in view. The promissory note referenced was dated the 14th of March. Her father had died on the 4th of March. He had not signed any instrument on the 14th of March, because on the 14th of March he had already been 10 days in the ground. She went back downstairs to the library. She retrieved the ledger, blotted and closed it, and set it in the steward's tray. Then she sat down in the chair nearest the fire and thought, carefully, about what she knew and what she did not yet know, and about the difference between the two. She had 7 weeks of dinners to draw on. 7 weeks of watching Lady Moorcroft move through rooms, of noting who received her warmest greeting and who received the precise, measured variety that meant nothing. 7 weeks of watching the way Mr. Callum Prest had sat at Lord Ashmore's dinner table last fortnight and smiled at Lady Moorcroft's elbow and described himself as a man of the law with no particular interest in any estate. She thought about that smile. She thought about it for a long time. If you have ever sat in a library and felt the specific silence of a thing becoming clear, you know the quality of that hour. The fire burned down. The frost thickened. Cecily Vane sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched a shape emerge from the available facts, the way a landscape emerges from morning fog, and when it was fully visible, she was very careful to look at it steadily rather than away. Lady Moorcroft wanted the Vane women gone. She had wanted it, Cecily suspected, since the morning she had arrived in this house, and Mrs. Pell had taken her hand and said, clearly, warmly, and within Lady Moorcroft's hearing, that she was so glad Cecily had come, that she was exactly the sort of person this house had needed. Lady Moorcroft was the sort of woman who noticed exactly the sort of person a house had needed. The promissory note was false. The debt was invented. The solicitor's agent was real enough, presumably, but his instrument was forged, and the forgery was designed to accomplish a single purpose. It would give Lord Ashmore sufficient cause to ask the Vane women to leave without any social cost to the house, without any scandal, with nothing but the quiet regret of a man obliged by law and by the comfort of his household to act as the situation required. It was, Cecily thought, genuinely clever. She did not admire it. She noticed it. There is a difference, and it matters. Then she rose and went to find Lord Ashmore. She had not sought him out before. She had been careful, in 7 months, to exist in this house, as a companion exists, present when needed, and invisible when not, taking up the precise amount of space she had been allocated, and no more. She had not asked him for anything. She had not, she realized now, understood until this moment that asking was permitted. His study was at the east end of the house, past the portrait gallery, and beyond the green baize door that separated the family's private quarters from the rest. She had never been past it. She stood before it for a moment, aware of the thinness of her evening gown in the cold corridor, aware of the sound of the house around her, the distant dinner service sounds, the fire in the wall sconce guttering in a draught. Then she knocked. Lord Ashmore said, from within, "Come." He was standing at the window when she entered, his back to the room, looking out at the dark. He was in evening clothes still, the dark coat fitted to a frame that suggested a man who had not allowed himself to go soft despite the years he had spent indoors, broad through the shoulder, straight in the spine, the white cravat a pale mark above the dark wool. His hair was dark and somewhat disordered, as if he had run a hand through it recently, and his profile, when he turned, was the sharp, specific profile she had catalogued in 7 months of careful peripheral vision. The jaw that carried tension like a habit. The eyes the pale gray of winter light through glass. The mouth set in a line that was not unkind, so much as armored. He looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment. "Miss Vane," he said at last. "My lord," she said. "I need to show you something." She had the letter in her hand. She had brought it. She crossed the room and held it out without preface, because she had decided on her way up the corridor that the only productive approach was to be exactly as direct as the situation required, and no more circumspect. He took the letter. He read it. He was a fast reader. She could tell by the quality of his stillness as his eyes moved down the page, the way it did not change, the way he was very controlled about not letting it change. Then he set it on the desk and looked at her. "When did this arrive?" he said. "This evening," she said. "My lord, the date on the promissory note is the 14th of March. A pause. "Your father died on the 4th, he said. "Yes." He looked at the letter again, not at the body of it. At the second note, in Lady Moorcroft's hand, Cecily watched him read it. She watched the line of his jaw change, very slightly, in the way a man's jaw changes when he has understood something he did not wish to understand. It was a small change. It was the kind of change most people would not have noticed. She noticed it. "I have my father's papers," she said, when the silence had run its proper length. Every correspondence, every instrument, every debt he acknowledged in the last 2 years of his life. There is no debt to any man named Prest. There is no instrument dated after the 27th of February, when his health no longer permitted him to manage a pen. Lord Ashmore said nothing. He had gone very still, the way very controlled men go still when they are thinking, rather than reacting. And the quality of it was so complete that the fire in the grate seemed to be the only thing in the room still in motion. "I am not," Cecily said carefully, "asking you to act on my behalf. I am telling you what I know, because I believe you are the sort of man who would wish to know it. What you do with the knowledge is your own affair." He looked at her then. Not the peripheral, careful look she was accustomed to reading at dinners and drawing-room evenings. Directly. The full gray weight of it. "Why?" he said. "Did you come to me rather than to my aunt?" She had expected the question. She had prepared for it. She said it plainly. "Because your aunt would worry, and because this is your house." He held her gaze for 3 seconds longer than necessary. Then he said, "Leave the letter." She left it. She went back through the green baize door and down the corridor and up to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark with the cedar box of her father's papers on her lap, and she breathed carefully, in and out, until the warmth came back to her hands. She did not know what he would do. She knew only what she had done. She had told the truth, clearly, without asking for rescue. She had placed the facts in the hands of the person with the power to act on them, and trusted that he was the kind of man who would. She had been watching him for 7 months. She was reasonably confident he was that kind of man. What she did not yet know was that Lord Ashmore had been watching her for considerably longer than 7 months in his thoughts, though not in hers. He had been attending to her since the morning in September, when he had come through the east garden in the early light, before the household was properly awake, and found her in the kitchen garden with her sleeves rolled up and her hair not yet properly dressed, reading to old Jennings the undergardener, who had been ill with a chest complaint and could no longer see print clearly enough to manage his own letters, and who had received a communication from his daughter in Dorset that he had not dared ask anyone in the house to read for fear of Charity's price. She had not known anyone was watching. She had read the letter, and then she had written the reply, sitting in the frost on an upturned crate, and she had said nothing to anyone about it. And she had gone back inside through the kitchen passage, as if she had simply been taking a morning walk. He had stood in the East Garden for some time after she disappeared. He had stood there long enough to understand what he was looking at. He had had a wife once. A woman of the right family, the right temper, the right accomplishments. Chosen because she was the correct choice, and because the correct choice had seemed, at 28, like a virtue rather than a failure of imagination. Eleanor had been kind and capable and entirely alone inside their marriage, and he had not understood until she was gone that he had been alone inside it too, that they had been two people carefully performing the correct version of themselves for an audience neither of them had wanted. She had died in the 3rd year. He had grieved her. He had grieved not Eleanor precisely, but the failure of imagination that had stood between them. The years they had spent being the correct choice for each other, while someone, somewhere, had been the real one. He had not expected to come across the real one in his kitchen garden at 7 in the morning, reading letters to an undergardener on an upturned crate. He had watched her at every dinner since. He had watched the way she managed his aunt's conversation, the quick intelligence she suppressed under the surface of it, the precise and knowing looks she exchanged with Mrs. Pell when Lady Moorcroft said something particularly designed to wound. He had watched her at the piano, once, playing for no one in the late afternoon when she believed the drawing room was empty, playing with a facility and a feeling she folded away the instant she heard the door. He had given her nothing. No greeting beyond the formal minimum. No acknowledgement of the quality he had observed. He had not known how to begin, and the gap between Marquis and companion was precisely the kind of gap the world used as a prohibition, and he had told himself, 7 months running, that he was not certain. He was certain now. He sat at his desk with the forged letter in front of him, and was, for the first time in a long time, completely certain. He sent for his own solicitor the following morning. He sent a message to the sheriff's deputy in the adjoining county, who was an old acquaintance from his school years and a man of notable discretion. He wrote 2 additional letters himself, one to the Wiltshire County Records Office requesting a certified copy of the late Mr. Vane's death record dated the 4th of March, and the other to a firm in Bristol he had dealt with professionally, asking after the standing and the principles of a Mr. Callum Prest. He did all of this before Lady Moorcroft came down to breakfast. She arrived in the dining room at 9:30 in her customary state of composed authority, her morning gown a precise shade of gray that said nothing could touch her, her rings in place, her hair immaculate. Cecily was already at the table, eating quietly, with her eyes on her plate in the manner of a woman who has spent the night in careful calculation and arrived at breakfast prepared. Lady Moorcroft took her seat. She accepted her coffee. She looked at Cecily with the pleasant, calibrated neutrality of a woman who considers herself several moves ahead. "Miss Vane," she said, "I hope the news of last evening has not disturbed you too greatly. These financial matters are so unpleasant. A companion in your circumstances must find such things especially alarming." "Not at all, my lady," Cecily said. "I find I am quite at ease." She said it pleasantly. She meant it. She had learned from her father, who had been a man of considerable acuity in his better years, that the appropriate response to a scheme was not alarm, but arithmetic. Lady Moorcroft's eyes narrowed by a fraction. Mr. Prest arrived at Hartwell on the Thursday. He was a slight man with a prosperous coat and a manner that worked hard to project authority without quite earning it. And he arrived in a hired carriage with 2 leather folios under his arm and a letter of introduction that cited Lady Moorcroft's name, which Cecily noticed he produced before anyone had asked him for it. Lord Ashmore received him in the library. Cecily was not in the library. She was in the drawing room with Mrs. Pell, working through a translation from the French, because Mrs. Pell had an interest in French philosophy that she pursued with cheerful stubbornness into her 60s, and because Cecily had volunteered for the work on the grounds that it kept her hands occupied and her ears positioned near the door. She heard raised voices once, briefly, from the direction of the library. Then nothing. 20 minutes later, Lord Ashmore walked past the drawing-room door. He stopped. He looked in. "Miss Vane," he said, "would you come with me, please?" Mrs. Pell looked up from her translation. She looked at her nephew's face. Something in it made her set the page down with considerable care. Cecily rose. The library had been rearranged since the previous evening. There was a second chair pulled up to the main table, which was now covered with papers. The forged letter. A certified document she had not seen before. 3 sheets of correspondence in a hand she did not recognize. At the center of it all, a look on Lord Ashmore's face that was not quite satisfaction and not quite fury, and was something altogether quieter than either. Mr. Prest was still in the room. He was standing near the window in the attitude of a man who has recently been given news he was not expecting, and has not yet finished processing its implications. Also in the room, to Cecily's considerable surprise, was Lady Moorcroft. She had been summoned, clearly. She stood near the fireplace with her gray composure beginning, at the edges, to fail. It was barely perceptible. It was the kind of failing that only shows in the hands, in the way a fan is held at a different angle than usual, in the slight elevation of the chin that is armor rather than confidence. "Sit down, please," Lord Ashmore said to Cecily with a courtesy that made Lady Moorcroft's chin lift another degree. He placed the certified document in front of her. It was the death record from Wiltshire, dated the 4th of March, signed and sealed. He placed next to it a letter from the Bristol firm. The firm reported that Mr. Callum Prest had no registered standing as a solicitor's agent. He was, instead, a man whose name appeared in the records of a private lending concern that had, 3 years ago, been engaged by an unnamed party to facilitate the recovery of certain contested debts, several of which had subsequently been found to be spurious. He placed, last, a folded note that Cecily recognized. It was Lady Moorcroft's handwriting, not the second note from the original letter. A different communication entirely. The Bristol firm had recovered it from Prest's own files, along with the instruction to appear at Hartwell and apply pressure at the named address. The communication directed Prest to present the claim against the Vane women in terms that would oblige Lord Hartwell to ask them to leave before the Christmas quarter, and to cite the amount of £430, which was a figure evidently chosen to be large enough to be serious and small enough to seem credible. Lady Moorcroft looked at the note in Cecily's hands. The quality of her composure changed. Cecily set the note down. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at Lady Moorcroft the way she had looked at problems in her father's accounts, clearly, without heat, taking the precise measure of what was in front of her. Lady Moorcroft said, after a moment, "The circumstances were more complicated than they appear." "They are not complicated at all," Lord Ashmore said. His voice was very level. "You employed a man to present a forged instrument against women living under my roof, under my protection, at my invitation, in order to remove them by means that would cost me nothing, and cost you nothing except the truth." "Mrs. Pell's companion," Lady Moorcroft said, with a precision that revealed exactly what she had been protecting. A companion, and her mother, Edmund, not connections, not family. I was acting in this household's interest. "You were acting in your own," he said. The word was not loud. It had the quality of a stone dropped into still water, not a splash but a displacement, a change in the surface that could not be undone. Lady Moorcroft looked at Cecily. What she was looking for Cecily could not be entirely sure. Triumph, perhaps, or the satisfaction of seeing the thing she had been afraid of confirmed. She found neither. She found a young woman sitting with her hands folded and her back straight, watching the proceedings with the patience of someone who had known, from the start, that the arithmetic would come right in the end. "Mr. Prest," Lord Ashmore said, "you will return whatever fee you have been paid to the solicitor I have engaged, who is waiting in the estate office. You will surrender both folios. You will leave Hartwell, and you will not return. And the matter will proceed no further on the understanding that discretion is in your considerable interest." Prest left without speaking. Lord Ashmore waited until the door had closed. Then he turned to Lady Moorcroft, and what he said to her was brief and measured and private enough that Cecily did not record it. She watched his profile instead, the jaw and the gray eyes and the restraint of a man who had earned the right to anger and was choosing, deliberately, not to spend it on spectacle. Lady Moorcroft left the room with the careful, measured tread of a woman reconstructing her composure, step by step. Then it was only the two of them, and the fire, and the papers on the table, and the sound of the frost outside. Cecily was aware of her own heartbeat, in a way she had not permitted herself to be until this moment. She was aware of him crossing to the other side of the table, not to the chair, but to the edge of it, standing close enough that the candlelight caught the angle of his jaw and the specific gray of his eyes in the warm light. He said, "You worked it out before you came to me." "Yes," she said. "All of it?" "Most of it. The Bristol letter confirmed the parts I could not prove from my father's papers alone." He looked at her for a moment. He had the particular quality of looking that she had noticed at dinners and could not quite name. It was not admiring exactly, and it was not analytical exactly, and it was not the social look of a man processing a woman's surface. It was the look of a man who was seeing something accurately and knew he was seeing it accurately and had known it for some time. "You might have come to me in September," he said, "when Mrs. Pell introduced you." "I had no claim on your attention in September," she said. "You have had a claim on my attention since September," he said. "I was simply not certain you wished to exercise it." The fire snapped. Outside, the frost lay on everything. She said, "I was not certain you would permit it." He said, "I would permit most things you wish to exercise, Miss Vane. I should be glad if you would take that as established." Her breath was perfectly steady. Her hands, folded in her lap, were not. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her. And the distance between them was the particular distance that has a name in the body before the mind is willing to give it one. He was very still. The way she had learned by now, he was still when he was waiting rather than withdrawing, when what looked like distance was the space he was holding until it was hers to close. She said, "That is a great deal to take as established on the basis of a conversation in a library." He said, "There have been 7 months of conversation before this one. I simply did not say any of them aloud." She breathed. She let the weight of that settle. "There are things," she said carefully, "that I would want said aloud." "I am aware," he said. "I intend to say them. Tonight has been a great deal for one evening, and I will not crowd what I intend to say into the space that this evening has already occupied." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something she had not done in 7 months of careful, composed service. She smiled. Genuinely, fully, without any management of it. Lord Ashmore's face did a thing she had never seen it do before. It is not easy to describe what a man's face does when he has been keeping it controlled for a very long time. And something gives way in it quietly, without alarm. It is not softening exactly. It is more like the way stone looks when the sun comes out. when what seemed like hardness resolves into texture, into dimension, into the evidence of weather and patience, and a long time of enduring without complaint. He looked as though he had been waiting for precisely this, and had not, until this moment, been entirely sure it was real. She left the library before the moment could be misread by anyone who happened to pass the door. She went back to the drawing room. She sat down across from Mrs. Pell, who looked at her face and set her translation aside entirely. "Well," Mrs. Pell said. "It is resolved," Cecily said. "Is it?" Mrs. Pell said, in a tone that suggested she was not referring to the matter of the forged letter. Cecily picked up the page of French. She looked at it without reading it. Then she set it down. "I believe," she said, "that it may take some time to fully resolve." "Most things worth resolving do," Mrs. Pell said, and returned to her translation with every appearance of satisfaction. He came to find her 2 days later, in the rose garden, in the thin November light. She was there because Mrs. Pell had asked her to cut what remained of the late roses before the first heavy frost took them, and she had been glad of the outdoor air and the specific quietness of the task. The particular pleasure of managing something with her own hands and making it neat. She heard his step on the gravel path before she saw him. She straightened. She kept her hands still. The basket of roses was at her feet, the last of the autumn blooms cut short and precise, their petals still holding color against the gray of the afternoon. The frost had not come in full yet, but it was in the air, the way November carries it, like a thing it intends to deliver before the week is out. He crossed the garden toward her at a pace that was not hurried. He was in his riding coat, the dark blue of it against the stone-gray sky, and his expression had the quality she associated now with a man who had decided something and was walking toward the decision rather than away from it. He said, "There is something I wish to say to you." She looked at him. She waited. He said it. He said it plainly, in the voice she had come to know as the one he used when he was not performing for anyone. The level, quiet voice that carried more weight than a raised one because it was his own. He spoke of 7 months and a kitchen garden, and a woman playing the piano in an empty room, and a letter in a library, and the specific, unambiguous thing he had recognized and been afraid to name until it had been made, by circumstance, impossible to continue not naming. He said that he had not done this well once before, that he had married at 28 for the right reasons, which were the wrong reasons, and that Eleanor had deserved better than a man going through the proper motions, and that he had understood this too late to make it right. He said it without self-pity and without the expectation of absolution. He said it because she had been honest with him and because honesty was the only thing he knew how to offer in return. When he had finished, she said, "I am glad you said it aloud." He said he was glad she was still here to hear it. She looked at him, at the gray eyes in the thin November light, at the jaw and the straight spine and the hand he had extended. Palm up, in the particular gesture that was not a command, but a question. She took his hand. They stood in the frost in the rose garden with the last roses around them, and the house at their backs, and the winter sky overhead, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because some things do not require words and are better without them. He brought her hand to his lips with the care of a man handling something he does not intend to let go. She felt it at her wrist first, the warmth of his mouth against her glove, and then the warmth along her arm, and she stood in the cold garden and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific sensation of being somewhere she was meant to be. There is something that happens in the body when what you expected to endure meets what you had not permitted yourself to want. It is not dramatic. It is very quiet. It is the kind of warmth that starts at the place where someone holds your hand and works its way slowly inward until all of you is at a temperature the cold outside cannot reach. Cecily felt it in the rose garden on a November afternoon, with the frost on the stones and the last roses cut in her basket. And she understood then why she had kept her father's papers so carefully, why she had slept with the cedar box under her bed, and read every document 3 times, and known her own ground with such precision. She had been living for 2 years in the careful posture of a woman preparing to defend territory she was not sure she still possessed. It was a posture that required vigilance, and vigilance was exhausting, and she had carried it so long that she had forgotten, somewhere in the 7 months of service and ledgers and French translations, that the ground she was defending had a purpose beyond its own preservation. She had been preparing for exactly this, without knowing she was preparing for it. She had been protecting the truth of her own life until someone came along who deserved to see it clearly. Lord Ashmore was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the library, directly, with the full gray weight of it, except that now there was nothing armored in his face. The jaw was not clenched. The eyes were not held still. He looked, simply, like a man who had found his way to the correct answer after a very long time of working the problem, and who intended, now that he had it, not to misplace it. He said, "I should like, if you are willing, to ask your mother for the opportunity to speak with her formally." "She will say yes," Cecily said. "You cannot know that." "I know my mother," she said, "and I know what she has been hoping for since September." The corner of his mouth moved. It was barely perceptible. On anyone else she would not have registered it. On him, having watched him for 7 months, she recognized it as a thing she intended to spend a great deal of time in the future, studying at close range. "You are very confident," he said. "I am accurate," she said. "There is a difference, and it matters." His hand tightened around hers. They walked back to the house together, at a proper distance, which fooled neither of them. Lady Moorcroft departed Hartwell before Christmas. She went to her own estate in Northamptonshire, which was large enough to accommodate her dignity, and far enough that the accommodation did not require either party to acknowledge its necessity. The servants below stairs said nothing that could be reported. Mrs. Pell gave a very small smile to her breakfast egg and said nothing at all. The announcement was made to Mrs. Pell in the drawing-room on a Friday afternoon, with the fire laid and the candles lit, and the snow beginning outside the long windows. Lord Ashmore said it in his plain way, without flourish. Mrs. Vane, who had been brought in on some pretext involving a cup of tea, said nothing for a moment, and then pressed her handkerchief to her mouth with a sound that was entirely unlike composure. Mrs. Pell set down her teacup with the deliberation of a woman who is placing it down very carefully in order to prevent herself from doing something more expressive. She looked at her nephew for a long moment. Then she looked at Cecily. Then she said, with the warmth of a woman who has been hoping for something for several months and has finally been given permission to say so, "Well, it is about time." Lord Ashmore looked, very briefly, as though he agreed. Cecily sat beside her mother and took her hand and felt the familiar warmth of being witnessed by someone who had always known her worth and had simply been waiting, as she had been waiting for the rest of the world to arrive at the same conclusion. The snow fell thicker. The fire burned. The cedar box of her father's papers was upstairs in her room, and inside it, tucked beneath the correspondence, was a letter her father had written to her in his last clear days, which she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. He had written that the world would try to tell her what she was worth, and that she must not let it be the only voice she heard. She had not. She had kept the other voice, too. The quiet one that knew exactly what she could do and did it anyway, even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. Someone had been watching. The watching had changed everything. That evening, after Mrs. Vane had gone to bed, and Mrs. Pell had taken her book to the fireside, Cecily sat at the piano in the drawing room and played the piece she had been playing alone in October, the Clementi Sonata she had learned from memory and never performed for anyone, because performance required an audience, and an audience required a willingness to be seen that she had, until recently, been in the habit of refusing herself. She played it all the way through. Lord Ashmore stood in the doorway and did not announce himself. He listened until the last chord resolved and hung in the room for a moment in the particular way music hangs when a house is warm and there is no other sound. Then he said, quietly, so quietly it barely disturbed the quiet, her given name. The first time in his voice. Cecily. She did not turn immediately. She let it land the way you let the last note of something land, with a pause that is not absence but recognition. Then she turned, and he was there. And the snow was outside and the fire was inside, and the last roses were drying in their vase on the window ledge, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. If Cecily's patience moved you, leave a word below, because some things deserve to be said aloud rather than merely felt. And stay, because there are more stories waiting of women who knew their own worth long before the world could be persuaded to agree. The cedar box remained on the shelf in her sitting room for the rest of her life, and her father's letter remained inside it, and on the days when the world was loud and the arithmetic seemed to be going wrong, she would take it out and read it once and put it back. She did not need it often. The house was warm. The roses held.